Blood dripped onto the cracked pavement, each drop a silent scream in the dusk. Ethan, barely 16, clutched his side, his vision blurring as the taunts of his attackers echoed in his ears. He wasn't just fighting for breathe, was fighting for the right to exist. The small town of Willow Creek, Ohio, was a place where secrets festered behind picket fences. Ethan Harper had always known he was different, but it wasn't until he met Caleb Monroe that he dared to name it. Caleb, with his quiet strength and eyes that held a universe of kindness, had been Ethan's refuge in a world that felt like a cage. They were two boys navigating the fragile edge of first love, stealing moments in the shadows of a town that preached conformity above all else. But that night, as Ethan staggered home, his shirt torn and his heart pounding, he realized love came with a price he might not survive. It started with whispers. Ethan and Caleb had been careful, meeting in the abandoned lot behind the old mill, where the hum of crickets drowned out their nervous laughter. They'd sit on a rusted bench, sharing dreams of escaping to a city where they could walk hand in hand without fear. Ethan wanted to be a writer, to tell stories that made people feel less alone. Caleb dreamed of architecture, of building spaces where everyone belonged. But Willow Creek had eyes everywhere, and secrets didn't stay buried long. The attack came on a humid August evening. Ethan had been walking home from the library, his backpack heavy with books on poetry and courage. He didn't see the group of boys' classmates he'd known since kindergarten until they surrounded him. "Freak," they spat, their voices thick with venom. "You think you can just be like that here?" The first punch landed on his jaw, sharp and disorienting. The rest was a blur of fists and slurs, the world tilting as Ethan fell to the ground. They left him there, bleeding and broken, with a warning, "Stay quiet, or next time you won't get up." Caleb found him an hour later, his face pale as he knelt beside Ethan. "I'm here," he whispered, his hands trembling as he helped Ethan sit up. "I'm so sorry." But Ethan didn't want apologies, he wanted to scream, to fight back, to demand why love had to hurt this much. Instead, he leaned into Caleb's touch, the only thing anchoring him to a world that felt like it was crumbling. The days that followed were a haze of pain and silence. Ethan's parents, devout and unyielding, didn't ask about the bruises. His mother's eyes flickered with something like shame when she saw him, but she said nothing. His father, a man of few words and fewer emotions, only grunted, "Toughen up." Ethan learned quickly that Willow Creek wasn't just a town, it was a machine that chewed up anyone who didn't fit its mold. At school, the whispers grew louder, the stares sharper. Caleb, desperate to protect him, started pulling away, his fear of losing Ethan warring with his fear of what staying close might cost them both. Ethan's only solace was his journal, where he poured out his anger and dreams. He wrote about Caleb's smile, about the way it felt to be seen, truly seen, for the first time. He wrote about the ache of hiding, of pretending to be someone he wasn't to survive. But even his words couldn't shield him from the growing sense that Willow Creek would never let him be whole. The town's judgment was a weight he carried in his bones, and every day it grew heavier. One night, unable to sleep, Ethan slipped out to the mill. Caleb was already there, sitting on their bench, his face half lit by the moon. "We can't keep doing this," Caleb said, his voice breaking. "They'll kill you, Ethan. Or me. Or both of us." Ethan wanted to argue, to say their love was worth fighting for, but the bruises on his ribs told a different story. They sat in silence, the space between them filled with unspoken promises and fears. When Caleb reached for his hand, Ethan pulled away, not out of anger, but because he couldn't bear the thought of Caleb getting hurt because of him. The next morning, Ethan made a decision. He couldn't stay in Willow Creek, not if it meant losing himself or Caleb. With a backpack stuffed with clothes and his journal, He left a note for his parents. "I'm sorry I'm not what you wanted." He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to leave before the town broke him completely. As the bus pulled out of Willow Creek, Ethan pressed his forehead against the window, watching the only home he'd ever known fade into the distance. He didn't cry. He couldn't. All he felt was a hollow ache where his heart used to be. The city of Chicago was a beast of glass and steel, swallowing Ethan whole. At 16, he was a runaway with no plan, just a burning need to be somewhere he could breathe. The streets were loud, chaotic, a stark contrast to Willow Creek's suffocating silence. But they didn't care who he loved as long as he could survive them. Ethan found a shelter in a gritty corner of the city, a place where lost souls gathered under flickering fluorescent lights. The volunteers were kind but overworked, their eyes carrying the weight of too many stories like his. Ethan shared a bunk with a boy named Marcus, who'd fled a home that didn't want him either. Marcus taught him the rules of survival: keep your head down, trust sparingly, and always have an exit plan. Ethan listened, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying Caleb's last words, his hand pulling away in the moonlight. He found work at a diner, washing dishes for cash under the table. The grease and heat were relentless, but the monotony gave him space to think. He wrote in his journal during breaks, his words raw and jagged, spilling out the pain of Willow Creek and the boy he'd left behind. He wrote letters to Caleb he never sent, each one a confession of love and regret. "I didn't want to leave you," he wrote in one, "but I couldn't stay and let them destroy us." The letters piled up in his backpack, a weight he carried alongside his guilt. Chicago wasn't kind, but it was indifferent, and that was enough. Ethan learned to navigate its rhythms: the clatter of the L train, the hum of late-night bars, the pulse of a city that didn't stop to judge him. He started taking night classes at a community center, where a teacher named M.S. Alvarez saw something in his writing. "You've got a voice," she told him, her eyes sharp but warm. "Don't let it stay quiet." She pushed him to submit his poems to local contests, and when he won his first, a small check and a certificate, Ethan felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt since Caleb: hope. But hope was a fragile thing. At night, alone in the shelter, Ethan's dreams were haunted by Willow Creek. He saw the faces of his attackers, heard his father's cold dismissal, felt Caleb's absence like a missing limb. He wondered if Caleb was still in that town, still hiding, still carrying the same fear. The thought of Caleb moving on, finding someone else, or worse, giving up on love altogether, kept Ethan awake. His journal the only place he could be honest. One evening, while walking home from the diner, Ethan passed a community center hosting an open mic. On impulse, he signed up, his hands shaking as he read a poem about a boy left bleeding for who he loved. The room was small, the crowd a mix of strangers and dreamers. But when he finished, the applause was deafening. A woman approached him afterward, her card reading editor, Chicago Free Press. "Your words cut deep," she said. "Ever thought about publishing?" Ethan hadn't, but her words planted a seed. He started writing more, pouring his pain into stories and essays. The Free Press published his first piece, a raw account of surviving Willow Creek. Readers responded, flooding the paper with letters. Some shared their own stories of rejection. Others apologized for the cruelty of people they'd never met. Ethan read each one, his heart torn between gratitude and grief. He was building a life, but it felt incomplete without Caleb. Months turned into a year, then two. Ethan moved out of the shelter into a tiny apartment, paid for with freelance writing gigs. He enrolled in a community college, studying literature and chasing the dream he'd shared with Caleb under the stars. But the past wasn't done with him. One night, he got a call from Marcus, who'd stayed in touch. "Someone's looking for you," Marcus said, his voice tense. "Said his name's Caleb. sounded desperate. Ethan's heart stopped. He hadn't heard Caleb's name spoken aloud in years, and it hit like a punch. What did he say? Ethan asked, his voice barely a whisper. Marcus hesitated. He said he's sorry, and he needs to see you. Ethan didn't know if he was ready to face Caleb, to reopen a wound that had never fully healed. But the thought of Caleb searching for him, after all this time, lit a spark he couldn't ignore. He spent the next day pacing his apartment, his journal open to a blank page. He wrote a single line, "If I see you again, will I still know you?" Then he grabbed his coat and headed to the address Marcus had given him, a rundown motel on the edge of the city. Whatever Caleb needed, Ethan would face it. Not because he was brave, but because he'd spent too long running. The motel's neon sign buzzed like a dying insect, casting a sickly glow over the parking lot. Ethan stood frozen, his breath visible in the chilly Chicago night, as he stared at the door to room 214. Caleb was behind it, or so Marcus had said, and the weight of 2 years apart pressed against Ethan's chest like a stone. He knocked, the sound sharp against the silence. The door creaked open, and there was Caleb, older, thinner, with shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there before. His black hair was longer, curling at the edges, and his brown eyes held a mix of relief and fear. "Ethan," he whispered, like saying the name might break something. Ethan wanted to speak, to scream, to ask why Caleb had come after all this time, but his throat closed around the words. Instead, he stepped inside, the door clicking shut behind him. The room was sparse, with a sagging bed and a single lamp flickering on the nightstand. Caleb sat on the edge of the mattress, his hands clasped tightly. "I didn't know if you'd come," he said, his voice raw. Ethan stayed standing, his arms crossed, a barrier against the flood of memories. "Why are you here, Caleb?" he asked, sharper than he meant. Caleb flinched, but his gaze didn't waver. "Because I owe you an apology. And because I'm running out of time." Ethan's stomach dropped. Caleb explained, his words halting but steady. After Ethan left Willow Creek, things got worse. The town turned on Caleb, blaming him for corrupting Ethan. His parents sent him to a conversion camp, a place of cold rooms and cruel promises to fix him. He endured months of shame disguised as salvation, but it only made him surer of who he was and who he'd lost. When he finally escaped, he tracked Ethan to Chicago, piecing together clues from shelter records and Ethan's published work. "I read your essay," Caleb said, pulling a crumpled copy of the Free Press from his bag. "The one about us. About what they did to you." His voice broke. "I should have fought harder for you. I should have left with you." Ethan's resolve cracked, and he sat beside Caleb, close enough to feel the warmth of him, but not close enough to touch. "You were scared," Ethan said quietly. "So was I." They talked for hours, the past spilling out like water from a broken dam. Caleb had been living on the fringes, taking odd jobs, haunted by the guilt of letting Ethan face Willow Creek's wrath alone. Ethan shared his own struggles, the loneliness of the city, the slow climb to rebuild himself. They didn't touch, but their words bridged the gap, tentative and fragile. When Caleb admitted he was still in love with Ethan, the confession hung in the air, heavy with possibility and pain. Ethan didn't know how to respond. He'd spent 2 years hardening his heart, convincing himself Caleb had moved on. But now, with Caleb's eyes searching his, he felt 16 again, hopeful and terrified. "I don't know if I can do this again," Ethan admitted. "Not after everything." Caleb nodded, his expression resigned but not defeated. "I just needed you to know I never stopped caring. Even if you hate me." Ethan didn't hate him. He wanted to, but the ache in his chest was love, not anger. They parted at dawn, with no promises, only an agreement to meet again. Caleb gave Ethan a slip of paper with his number, scrawled in shaky handwriting. "If you want to find me," he said, "I'll be here." Ethan tucked it into his pocket, unsure if he'd ever use it. Back in his apartment, Ethan's journal became his battleground. He wrote about Caleb's return, about the way his heart raced and broke at the same time. He wrote about forgiveness, about whether he could trust Caleb or himself enough to try again. His writing took on a new urgency. His stories no longer just about survival, but about reclaiming what had been stolen. The Free Press offered him a regular column, and he poured his heart into it, each piece a step toward healing. But Willow Creek wasn't done with him. A letter arrived, forwarded from the shelter. It was from his mother, her handwriting stiff and formal. "Your father is sick," she wrote. "He wants to see you." Ethan stared at the letter, the words blurring. He hadn't spoken to his parents since he left, hadn't wanted to. But the thought of his father, a man who'd never understood him, now reaching out, stirred something complicated: anger, grief, and a faint flicker of duty. He called Caleb that night, his voice shaking. "I have to go back," he said, "to Willow Creek. Will you come with me?" There was a long pause. Then Caleb's steady voice, "Yes." Ethan didn't know what waited for them in that town, but he knew he couldn't face it alone. As he hung up, he felt the weight of the past and the pull of the future, both demanding to be reckoned with. The bus to Willow Creek smelled of diesel and regret, rattling along highways Ethan thought he'd never see again. Caleb sat beside him, his knee brushing Ethan's, a silent anchor in the storm of memories. Ethan clutched his journal, the pages filled with words he wasn't sure he could say aloud, not to his father, not to this town. Willow Creek hadn't changed. The same faded diner, the same church steeple piercing the sky, the same air thick with judgment. Ethan's childhood home loomed at the end of Maple Street, its white paint peeling like old skin. Caleb squeezed his hand as they approached the door, a small act of courage that made Ethan's heart ache. His mother answered, her face a mask of exhaustion and guilt. "You came," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan nodded, unable to trust his own. His father lay in a hospital bed set up in the living room, his once imposing frame withered by illness. Cancer, his mother had written, aggressive and unforgiving. Ethan stood at the foot of the bed, searching for the man who'd told him to toughen up after he'd been beaten. "Ethan," his father rasped, his eyes cloudy but focused. "I was wrong." The words hit like a physical blow, unraveling years of silence. His father spoke haltingly, admitting he'd been afraid of what Ethan was, of what it meant for their family in a town like this. "I didn't know how to love you," he said, tears spilling. "I'm sorry." Ethan wanted to scream, to demand why it took dying to say this. But the man before him wasn't the unyielding figure of his childhood, was broken, human, pleading for forgiveness. Ethan didn't know if he could give it, but he sat beside the bed, listening as his father spoke of regrets, of missed chances. Caleb stayed in the background, his presence a quiet strength. When Ethan's mother joined them, her apologies came too, softer but no less heavy. "We didn't understand," she said. "We should have protected you." The visit stretched into hours, then days. Ethan and Caleb stayed in a motel on the edge of town, the same one where Caleb had found Ethan in Chicago. They talked late into the night, untangling the pain of their past. Caleb admitted he'd spent years blaming himself for Ethan's attack, for not being brave enough to stand with him. Ethan confessed he'd run not just from Willow Creek, but from the fear that Caleb might stop loving him. They were older now, scarred but stronger, and their hands found each other in the dark, tentative but sure. Willow Creek wasn't ready for them. Word of their return spread, and the stares returned to some curious, some hostile. Ethan's old attackers, now men in their late teens, still lurked in the diner, their eyes narrowing when they saw him with Caleb. Ethan felt the old fear creep in, but Caleb's steady gaze reminded him he wasn't 16 anymore. He was a writer with a voice, a man who'd survived worse than their hate. He started writing again, this time about Willow Creek itself. His column in the Free Press became a series, Letters from a Town That Hates. Each piece dissected the town's cruelty, its hypocrisy, but also its capacity for change. He wrote about his father's apology, about the slow thaw in his mother's heart. The series went viral, shared across platforms, reaching readers far beyond Chicago. Letters poured in, some from Willow Creek residents, confessing their own complicity in the town's culture of silence. Others were from kids like Ethan had been, desperate for hope. One evening, as Ethan and Caleb walked through town, a group of teens approached. Ethan tensed, ready for a fight, but the leader, a girl with bright purple hair, held out a copy of his latest column. "This changed my brother," she said. "He's gay, and he was scared to tell anyone. You made him feel like he could." Ethan's throat tightened. He hadn't realized his words were reaching kids still trapped in Willow Creek's grip. The encounter lit a fire in Ethan. He and Caleb began planning a community event, a reading of his work, open to anyone willing to listen. They booked the town hall, expecting resistance. But the mayor, a new face who'd read Ethan's columns, approved it. "This town needs to hear you," she said. Ethan wasn't sure if it was courage or desperation, but he agreed. As the date approached, he felt the weight of what he was about to do, confront Willow Creek, not with anger, but with truth. The town hall smelled of old wood and wax, its folding chairs filled with faces Ethan both recognized and didn't. Some were curious, others skeptical, a few openly hostile. Ethan stood at the podium, his hands steady despite the racing of his heart, with Caleb in the front row, his eyes a beacon of calm. He began with a story not his own, but one from a letter he'd received. A boy, 15, from a town like Willow Creek, who'd read Ethan's column and found the courage to come out to his parents. The room was silent as Ethan read, his voice carrying the weight of every kid who'd ever felt unwanted. He transitioned to his own story, the night he was left bleeding at 16, the years of running, the slow rebuilding of himself. He didn't accuse. He simply told the truth, letting it hang heavy in the air. Caleb joined him on stage, sharing his own journey, the conversion camp, the guilt, the search for Ethan. Together, they painted a picture of love that refused to break, even under the weight of a town's hatred. The audience shifted, some leaning forward, others looking away. When Ethan opened the floor for questions, a man stood, Mr. Thompson, his old history teacher, who'd once turned a blind eye to the bullying. "I didn't know how bad it was," he said, his voice thick. "I should have done something." Ethan nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The event stretched late, with stories pouring out. A mother admitted she'd pushed her son away for being gay, now desperate to make amends. A teenager, voice shaking, said Ethan's words had kept him from giving up. By the end, the room was a tapestry of confessions and regrets, woven with tentative hope. Ethan and Caleb left the hall hand in hand, the night air cool against their skin. For the first time, Willow Creek felt less like a cage. The series continued, each column a call for change. Ethan's words reached beyond Willow Creek, picked up by national outlets. He was invited to speak at schools, community centers, even a conference in New York. Caleb went with him, their bond growing stronger with every shared step. They weren't just surviving anymore, they were building something new, a life where love didn't have to hide. Back in Willow Creek, change came slowly. The diner started hosting a monthly open mic, where kids like the girl with purple hair shared their stories. The church, once a bastion of judgment, began a support group for families of LGBTQ youth, led by Ethan's mother. She and Ethan were rebuilding too, their conversations halting but honest. His father's health declined, but he lived long enough to attend one of Ethan's readings, his frail hand gripping Ethan's with pride. Ethan's attackers never apologized, but they faded into the background. Their influence diminished as the town began to shift. Ethan didn't need their regret, found his own strength. He and Caleb moved back to Chicago, renting a small apartment together. Ethan's writing career grew, his first book, a memoir slated for publication. Caleb enrolled in architecture school, his dream no longer just a whisper. One night, as they sat on their tiny balcony overlooking the city, Caleb pulled out a ring, simple and silver. "I don't want to lose you again," he said, his voice steady. Ethan's eyes filled with tears, not of pain, but of a joy he'd never thought possible. He said yes, and they held each other, the city's lights a constellation of second chances. But Ethan knew the story wasn't over. Willow Creek still had work to do, and so did he. He kept writing, each word a brick in the world he and Caleb were building, a world where no one had to bleed for who they loved. He started planning a return to Willow Creek, not to settle old scores, but to show the town what was possible when love was met with courage instead of fear. Ethan's memoir, Left Bleeding, hit shelves on a crisp October morning, its cover a stark image of a cracked pavement under a street lamp. The book was more than his story, it was a love letter to Caleb, to every kid still hiding, to every town that needed to change. Its release sparked a firestorm, with reviews calling it raw, unflinching, and necessary. Willow Creek felt the impact first. Copies sold out at the local bookstore, a place that had once banned controversial titles. Ethan's words forced the town to look in the mirror, and not everyone liked what they saw. The diner's open mic nights grew, drawing crowds from neighboring towns. Kids who'd once been silenced now stood on stage, their voices echoing Ethan's courage. The girl with purple hair, whose name was Lily, became a regular, her poems a fierce call for acceptance. Ethan and Caleb returned to Willow Creek for a book signing, the town hall packed with faces old and new. Ethan's mother was there, her eyes red but proud. His father had passed weeks earlier. His last words to Ethan a whispered, "I'm proud of you." The grief was heavy, but it fueled Ethan's resolve. He read from his book, his voice steady as he described the night he was attacked, the fear that followed, and the love that carried him through. Caleb stood beside him, their hands clasped, a quiet defiance against the town's past. The event wasn't without tension. A small group protested outside, holding signs about family values. But inside, the mood was different. People lined up to share their stories, to thank Ethan, to apologize. A man Ethan vaguely recognized one of his attackers' fathers approached, his face etched with shame. "My son was part of what happened to you," he said. "I didn't raise him to be that way. I'm sorry." Ethan nodded, the words not erasing the past, but loosening its grip. The signing turned into a town meeting, unplanned but inevitable. Residents spoke of starting a scholarship for LGBTQ youth, renaming a street after Ethan's book, creating a safe space at the community center. Ethan listened, his heart torn between skepticism and hope. He didn't trust Willow Creek to change overnight, but he saw cracks in its armor, cracks he'd helped make. Back in Chicago, Ethan's life was fuller than he'd ever imagined. His book climbed bestseller lists, and he was invited to speak across the country. Caleb, now in his second year of architecture school, designed a community center for their neighborhood, a place where kids like them could find refuge. They planned their wedding, small and simple, with Marcus and MS. Alvarez as witnesses. The ceremony was on their balcony, the city skyline their backdrop. Their vows a promise to keep fighting for each other. For others. But Ethan's thoughts kept drifting to Willow Creek. He and Caleb decided to return one last time. Not for a signing or a speech, but to build something lasting. They proposed a youth center, funded by Ethan's book royalties and donations from readers. The town council, under pressure from a new generation of residents, approved it. Ethan and Caleb worked with Lily and other local teens to design it. A space of bright colors and open doors, where no one had to hide. Construction began in spring, beside a vacant lot where the old mill once stood. Ethan stood in the dirt, watching bulldozers clear the ground, Caleb at his side. "This is ours," Caleb said, his voice thick with emotion. Ethan nodded, thinking of the bench where they'd once dreamed of a different life. That bench was gone now, but its memory lived in this new foundation. The center's opening was set for summer, and Ethan felt a mix of pride and fear. He knew Willow Creek wasn't fully changed. Some would always cling to their hate. But he also saw the kids who'd come to the open mics, the parents who'd started listening, the teachers who'd begun to speak up. Change wasn't a straight line, but it was happening, one story at a time. The youth center's opening day dawned bright, the sun glinting off the new building's glass windows. Ethan and Caleb stood at the entrance. A ribbon stretched across the doors. A crowd gathered under a banner that read Haven House. The name was Lily's idea, a place where everyone could be themselves. No questions asked. Ethan cut the ribbon, his hands steady despite the weight of the moment. The crowd cheered, a mix of Willow Creek locals and out-of-towners drawn by Ethan's story. Inside, the center was alive with color murals painted by local teens, bookshelves stocked with stories of resilience, a stage for open mics. Caleb had designed every detail, his architectural vision a love letter to the kids who'd come after them. Lily took the microphone first, her purple hair now streaked with blue. She read a poem about her brother, who'd come out after reading Ethan's book. "This place," she said, her voice breaking. "This is what we needed when we were scared." The room erupted in applause, and Ethan felt Caleb's hand in his, grounding him. They'd built this together, not just for themselves, but for every kid who'd ever felt like they didn't belong. The day was filled with speeches, music, and stories. Ethan's mother helped serve lemonade, her smile tentative but genuine. The mayor spoke, acknowledging the town's past failures and pledging to do better. Even Mr. Thompson, the history teacher, was there, volunteering to lead a writing workshop. Ethan watched it all, his heart full but heavy. He knew this was a beginning, not an end. That night, Haven House hosted its first open mic. Kids and adults alike took the stage, their voices weaving a tapestry of pain, hope, and defiance. A boy, no older than 14, spoke of his fear of coming out, his words echoing Ethan's own at that age. Ethan found him afterward, offering a quiet, "You're not alone." The boy's eyes lit up, and Ethan saw himself reflected, scared, but ready to fight. The center became a beacon, drawing attention far beyond Willow Creek. Ethan's book sales funded expansions, a counseling room, an art studio, a library. Caleb's designs were praised in architecture circles, earning him a scholarship to finish his degree. They settled into a rhythm, splitting their time between Chicago and Willow Creek, their love a quiet strength that carried them through. But not everyone was ready to change. A small group of holdouts picketed the center, their signs uglier than before. One night, a brick shattered a window, a note tied to it, "You don't belong here." Ethan's first instinct was fear, the old pain of 16 surging back. But Caleb was there, his voice calm. "They're loud because they're losing," he said. The next day, volunteers showed up to repair the window, their numbers dwarfing the protesters. Ethan wrote about the incident in his next column. Not with anger, but with resolve. Hate breaks windows, he wrote, but love builds homes. The piece went viral, shared by thousands, including celebrities and activists. Donations poured in, enough to fund a second center in a neighboring town. Ethan and Caleb became symbols of resilience, their story a testament to what love could endure. As summer faded, Ethan stood in Haven House, watching a group of teens paint a new mural. Caleb joined him, his arm around Ethan's shoulders. "We did this," Caleb said, his voice soft. Ethan nodded, thinking of the blood on the pavement, the years of running, the love that had brought him back. He'd left Willow Creek bleeding, but he'd returned to make it heal. The town wasn't perfect. Some would never accept him, or Caleb, or the kids who filled Haven House with laughter and dreams. But Ethan didn't need their approval anymore. He had Caleb, he had his voice, and he had a purpose. Willow Creek had tried to break him, but instead, it had forged him into someone who could make it kneel not in shame, but in recognition of what it could become. Years passed, and Haven House grew into a network of centers across Ohio, each one a testament to Ethan and Caleb's vision. Ethan's second book, a novel about a boy finding his place in a world that didn't want him, won awards and sparked conversations in places Willow Creek could only dream of reaching. Caleb's architectural firm specialized in community spaces, each design a promise of inclusion. Willow Creek itself was changing, slowly but undeniably. The diner now flew a rainbow flag, a small gesture that meant everything to the kids who walked by. The church hosted pride events, tentative at first, but growing bolder each year. Lily, now in college, returned to lead Haven House's youth programs, her brother a counselor at her side. Ethan's mother became a regular volunteer, her quiet presence a bridge between the town's past and its future. Ethan and Caleb married in a ceremony that filled Haven House with flowers and laughter. Marcus gave a toast, his eyes wet with pride. Ms. Alvarez read a poem she'd written for them, her voice carrying the weight of every kid she'd taught to dream. The town showed up, not everyone, but enough to make Ethan's heart swell. Even Mr. Thompson was there, his workshop now a staple of the center's offerings. The night of their wedding, Ethan and Caleb stood on the roof of Haven House, the stars above a mirror of their first nights together. "I thought I'd lose you forever," Ethan said, his voice soft. Caleb pulled him close, his ring glinting in the moonlight. "You never did," he replied. They kissed, the sound of the town's quiet hum below them, a reminder of how far they'd come. Ethan's writing never stopped. His columns evolved into a platform for others, amplifying voices that had been silenced too long. He wrote about love, about pain, about the slow work of changing hearts. His words reached kids in towns like Willow Creek, giving them courage to be themselves. He and Caleb spoke at conferences, their story a beacon for those still fighting. One spring, Willow Creek renamed the street where Ethan had been attacked. Harper Way, the sign read, unveiled at a ceremony where Ethan and Caleb stood hand in hand. The mayor spoke of redemption, of a town learning to be better. Ethan didn't speak of forgiveness, wasn't sure he'd fully found it, but he spoke of hope, of building a world where no one had to bleed for who they were. The ceremony ended with a surprise. The town had raised funds for a statue in Haven House's courtyard, a simple figure of two hands clasped, etched with the words "Love Wins." Ethan's eyes filled as he traced the words, remembering the bench where he and Caleb had once dreamed. The crowd knelt, not in worship, but in a moment of collective regret and resolve, a silent promise to do better. Ethan and Caleb returned to Chicago, their life a tapestry of love and purpose. They adopted a daughter, Mia, whose laughter filled their apartment with light. Ethan wrote her stories. Caleb built her tree houses, and together they taught her that love was worth fighting for. Willow Creek was no longer home, but it was part of their story, a place that had tried to break them, but instead taught them how to rebuild. As Ethan sat at his desk one night, his latest manuscript open, he thought of the boy he'd been at 16, bleeding on the pavement. That boy had dreamed of a world where he could be whole. Looking at Caleb, asleep on the couch with Mia curled against him, Ethan knew he'd found it. Willow Creek had knelt, not because he demanded it, but because he'd shown them what was possibly a world where love didn't just survive, but thrived.